started. Um, Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Fintech Compliance Simplified, the Essentials of Auditing and Implementation. I'm James Soliday, and I'll be your host for today's session. We are thrilled to have you join us as we dive into the critical aspects of, of compliance in the fintech industry and share actionable insights into how to navigate this complex landscape efficiently. But before we begin, I want to introduce you to our esteemed speakers. Lance Udasco, who is a senior compliance engineer here at DuploCloud, and Laith Kanafsa, who is an auditing managing partner at Thoropass. Together, they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience that will provide you with valuable perspectives and practical guidance. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about compliance in fintech. Within the fintech industry, compliance is not just a regulatory requirement. It's a foundational pillar of trust and credibility. As the financial technology continues to evolve, the regulatory landscape becomes increasingly complex. And we'll discuss that in much more detail. And then next, we'll be discussing a specific case study where we will be building an audit and compliance roadmap. This strategic plan outlines your compliance steps, goals, and timeline. We'll start with a risk assessment to identify vulnerabilities and then develop tailored policies, procedures, and controls. After creating the roadmap, we'll focus on implementation and optimization so that you can execute your compliance plan, monitor its effectiveness, and make adjustments as needed. And finally, the last step is how are we going to define success? We want to establish clear performance, key performance indicators, and demonstrate the effectiveness of your compliance efforts. KPIs, for example, can be metrics such as the number of compliance audits passed, the time taken to resolve compliance issues, and the level of employee adherence to compliance policies. So, want to do some housekeeping about this. Really just trying to set up table stakes with everything, in that compliance in fintech is crucial as it ensures adherence to the regulatory standards, safeguards against financial fraud, data breaches, and operational risks. It helps you build trust with customers and stakeholders and protects a company's reputation and avoid hefty fines in legal issues. But with that comes its challenges, and I'm sure this is one of the reasons why you're all here. So within the regulatory industry, fintech companies operate in a highly regulated environment. There are constantly changing regulations. Companies must continually adapt to the practices and systems to stay compliant, requiring constant vigilance and flexibility to integrate new regulations in existing processes. And then there's just a huge cost that's involved in this and ensuring compliance, which whether it's technology or headcount, hiring skilled personnel, or ongoing training programs to keep staff updated, it's a lot, and non-compliance can also lead to costly fines and legal fees. And then the last part is we want to talk about the limited resources. Basically, there's a scarcity of skilled compliance professionals or scalable solutions. And then finally, the implications for non-compliance. Financial penalties can significantly impact a company's bottom line, drain resources, and potentially lead to bankruptcy. Positive reputation attracts the most customers and investors who prioritize ethical and legal business practices, while conversely, non-compliance can lead to negative publicity, damaging a company's reputation and making it harder to attract new clients. And then finally, customers want to feel confident that their financial data is secure. So adhering to these compliance standards demonstrate a commitment to data security and ethical practices, which builds trust among customers. So wanted to kind of lay the table stakes between the importance of compliance, what are some of the pain points, and what are the implications of non-compliance. Now we're going to transform over to Thoropass and building an audit and roadmap and how to do that effectively. Like, I'll let you take it over from that here.
Thanks, James, and good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be here today. So before we get started in talking through specific compliance frameworks and an audit roadmap, wanted to take a minute just to introduce Thoropass to the audience. We are an information security compliance and audit solution, really built to help customers implement, manage, and demonstrate their compliance with information security standards and frameworks through audits. We provide a hybrid solution that's a technology platform to enable compliance managers to really manage their day-to-day information security program, while also including the audit within the same platform, making it a more streamlined and easier, more streamlined solution in order to be able to demonstrate your compliance with specific information security standards. If you want to move to the next slide, James.
Mhm.
One of the biggest questions we get from our customers is, how do I know which framework to choose when I'm going through compliance? Sometimes customers will come to us because they're being asked about a framework from one of their prospects or customers, or they're being proactive and they really want to start implementing sound information security compliance programs within their companies and don't know where to start. Really, we think there are three questions you should be asking yourself as an organization that's starting your compliance program. The first and maybe most important is considering what types of data your company, your solution stores or transmits. This is the primary way to really understand which compliance framework is relevant to your specific use case. Depending on the specific data, it could help drive which compliance framework you should pursue or at least start with in the very beginning. The second is understanding the type of security and information assurances that you make to your customers and your end users, and also what your buyers actually want to see. Generally, we know that SOC 2 is probably the most universal and entry point information security framework that everybody wants to see, generally accepted really in the US. But sometimes customers will have more nuanced asks depending on some of their commitments that they make to their end users. And third, focusing on scalability. Building a strong foundation of information security compliance from day one will really help you evolve your compliance program over time as your company scales and gets bigger and matures. You definitely want to start building that foundation from the very beginning in order to reap the rewards of a strong and sound information security program as you scale your business. But two common information security frameworks we typically see in the fintech space are SOC 2 and PCI. And I'll talk a little bit about both here in the coming slides.
All right. And well, first we'll talk about SOC 2. Leif, I'll leave it up to you.
Yep. So SOC 2, you've probably heard of it. You may or may not know what it is. SOC 2 stands for System and Organizational Control. It's an auditing standard that was introduced by the AICPA, the American Institute for Certified Public Accountants, really to test internal controls over an information security program. The idea of SOC 2 is it's really intended for service providers that store, process, and transmit sensitive information of any kind. The idea is for SOC 2 to provide some type of validation and assurance when it comes to a company's security, availability, confidentiality, privacy, and processing integrity commitments and system requirements. Your end users, your buyers, your prospects, the value they see in a SOC 2 really is that you talk the talk and walk the walk at the same time. So you say that you're securing specific information. They want to see that you're doing it. By getting a SOC 2, you have an auditor, an independent auditor, attest to whether or not you're doing what you say you're doing when it comes to information security. Who needs a SOC 2 report? Really, it's any company that stores, transmits, processes sensitive information. But more and more, we've been seeing it really from these three segments of the market. The first is VC-backed B2B startups. We're seeing this earlier and earlier in a startup's life cycle, where sometimes even pre-funding, companies are getting asked for their SOC 2 reports and pursuing SOC 2 compliance. Vendors of enterprise buyers. So your specific vendors may be asking about your SOC 2 reports. If they're getting into business with you, they want to know that any information shared between the entities is secure and that you do have a sound information security program. And really, all companies in the US market today, in order for your service or product to go through procurement with a company in the US market, they'll typically ask, at the very least, for your actual SOC 2 report. SOC 2 really is the foundation of all information security in the US market, and is really looked at table stakes in order for you to do business with other businesses.
And next,
Uh,
after you get a SOC 2 report, I'm assuming if you're in a highly regulated industry such as fintech, PCI is probably next.
exactly. Great segue into PCI, James. So PCI is a little bit more nuanced of a framework. It's a little bit more prescriptive as a framework, and it applies to a smaller subset of the market, really for organizations that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. This can include merchants, processors, acquiring banks, and service providers. PCI has a slew of requirements that they include, but if we were to summarize it into 3 specific buckets, you can look at network security, data protection, and access control as a primary focus drivers within PCI. The idea is to protect sensitive cardholder data from theft and fraud. So when it comes to cardholder information, PII, specific credit card numbers, and all of the metadata that goes into processing a credit card transaction, PCI compliance really looks at how an organization is segmenting their environment, but also protecting the cardholder data. We see this as usually a requirement for fintech companies looking to do business with financial institutions, banks, sometimes even insurance companies. Will ask for this if you store, process, or transmit cardholder data. And funny enough, it's not only applicable to fintechs, it is actually generally applicable to all organizations that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. There are a few levels of PCI, the assess compliance. We won't get too nuanced into every single level, but the main point here is there are 4 levels of PCI. Level 1 is the most strict, requires the most intense audit. And out of a level 1 audit, you get what's called a ROC, or report on compliance. Level 1 is applicable to merchants or providers who process 6 million plus transactions per year when it comes to credit card transactions. From there, you kind of have a tapering off of PCI level requirements based on the specific transactions that you process per year. Level 2, merchants anywhere between 1 and 5 million transactions will require level 2. Level 3, anywhere between 20,000 and 1 million transactions. And level 4, fewer than 20,000 transactions. The caveat here is the company that you're doing business with can ask for you to do a level higher than what you're currently processing from a transaction perspective. So if you're processing 1 million transactions and you want to do business with a big bank, they may require you to have PCI level 1, even though you're processing only 1 million credit card transactions.
Thank you, Laith. Now we're going to transition to once you're auditing for SOC 2 and PCI compliance, how do you implement that in the cloud? And I'll turn it over to Lance on this.
Thank you. So before we get into how DuploCloud really takes you through the process of implementing, deploying, and running on compliant infrastructure, I'd like to just first start by defining what information security is. This is kind of, I think a lot of people overcomplicate what it is when they think about it, but it really comes down to a CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is pretty easy to understand. Integrity, some examples of information security events involving integrity. Examples of unfriendly nation states inserting stories into newspaper websites to make it seem like legitimate stories, right? They've impacted the integrity of that paper's website. You can no longer trust that all the data is what it should be. Availability comes in 2 forms. commonly, malicious and non-malicious. So malicious availability security events would be ransomware. Non-malicious availability security events would involve recently CrowdStrike, right? I think that's a pretty good example of how the biggest disaster recovery event in history was actually a non-malicious security event. All right, let's move on here. We'll go into how we start working with our customers. So it really begins with discovery. Obviously you have a workload, which we don't yet know. So we have to start by asking questions and having conversations, right? Identity management, access control, and logging strategies are your AAA services. So it's authentication, authorization, and accounting. So who are you? What can you do? And what did you do? Right. So those are your AAA services. We then start to identify your requirements around network security, public subnets, private subnets, things like that. Encryption, that's of data in transit and at rest. Sometimes you may have compliance requirements that allow you to terminate TLS encryption at a load balancer. Sometimes you may need end-to-end encryption, in which case you need private certificate management on your backend hosts, right? Of course, there's your disaster recovery requirements and also high availability, which has some overlap but is different. Hardening requirements that could be for containers, EC2 virtual machine hosts, the cloud control plane itself, then vulnerability and patch management, right? And once you've deployed compute resources, how do you make sure they're patched, right? There's going to be applications on there or packages that have updates, and what is the best way to ensure that you don't have vulnerabilities that are critical in 60, 90, 120 days old, right? What's the best way to deal with those? Endpoint protection, that could be antivirus, integrity monitoring, intrusion prevention, or even mobile device management. And then finally, how do you monitor this, right? How do we ensure that you're getting alerts when you're basically finding out that there is a performance issue with your platform before a customer tells you, right? No one ever wants to be in that scenario. Okay, we can move on here. All right, so once we have an understanding of what's required from a technical perspective, right? We begin to overlay that with any regulatory, statutory, contractual compliance requirements that you may have, right? As Laith mentioned, you may have a compliance requirement based on the amount of credit cards that you process for PCI level 3. But you have a contractual requirement with a partner that requires PCI level 1, right? So what's required, via laws or other frameworks is not necessarily always going to meet your contractual requirements. So we want to make sure we understand all of those requirements when we start to put together, your design, right? What this workload is going to look like. We follow best practices as outlined by the Cloud Adoption Framework and the Well-Architected Framework, both published and matured over the years by AWS, right? And the shared responsibility model as well. I want to, if you could, let's go to, I believe I should have, here. Yeah, just to go over the shared responsibility model, right? If anyone's not familiar, AWS is responsible for security of the cloud. Their cloud is a secure place to put your workloads. But within that workload, on that cloud, the customer, you, are responsible for certain security controls. And depending on your requirements, that could be a little or a lot, right? We can go back to patching, for example. It's not necessarily Amazon's responsibility to patch your underlying hosts, right? That would be, for them to do that automatically would be probably a breach of privacy, because they'd have an unprecedented amount of access to your host, which you were not expecting. We can also advise on how you can shift those responsibilities, right? Let's say today you're hosting a database engine, such as MySQL, on an EC2 instance, or you're self-hosting in a data center. That comes with a lot of responsibility and administrative overhead, like I said, about patching and backups and things like that. In that case, we would probably recommend using Amazon's RDS, or Relational Database Service, which is a managed platform and helps shift a lot of that responsibility over to Amazon, right? Because you no longer have access to the underlying host, so you're no longer responsible for patching it. You're essentially responsible for the security measures that are required within the database, if that's some type of encryption, and both authentication and authorization to the database. How do you manage user access? So we help with that, help customers understand that, and really leverage it to the best of their abilities to reduce their administrative overhead. Okay. I wanted to give some examples of what some compliance controls are. In this case, I used NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework. I think it's an excellent framework that can generally apply to a lot of workloads and easily be mapped to other controls that may be within SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or high trust. As you can see here, some of this language is from Amazon's own documentation. What is the customer responsible for, right? So for identity management, customers are responsible for developing, documenting, maintaining, disseminating, and implementing an access control policy. So it really starts with developing the policy. We can certainly advise on some of the best practices that we feel make sense, but at the end of the day, your organization has to really decide what makes the most amount of sense based on your size, your budget, and the sensitivity of the data that you're processing, right? But when it comes to the point when you're ready to implement, that's really where DuploCloud starts to shine, right? And we can take you through that implementation process and really simplify a lot of the service deployments in a manner that, from the initial deployment, they meet your compliance requirements instead of having to bolt those on after, right? We want to get it in there right from the start. Okay, let's move on.
Yep. And we'll talk about the architecture.
Yeah. So before moving forward, right after we've gone through the discovery phase, we understood all the best practices or applied all the best practices, understood the compliance requirements. We want to make sure we're on the same page, right? So we start to put together architecture, network documentation, high-level architecture diagrams, right, to show, hey, this is what we're putting in place. These are the security controls. This is how we meet your compliance requirements, right? And when you integrate with Thoropass with your workload, you'll find that a lot of what we're providing guidance on from the very beginning are controls that Thoropass identifies as required anyway, based on the framework that you choose for your organization. Okay. And then again, once we start, this is where we also start to show the benefit of our DevOps and DevSecOps experience, right? Where we really can start to deploy your infrastructure as code, version control it, have rollback capabilities, allow easy collaboration through your code repositories, right? And constantly improve on the environment as we work through different levels such as dev, stage, QA, and then finally to production, to make sure that we're confident that we're not deploying any updates to production that affect availability, confidentiality, or integrity. Right? Okay, let's keep going. So after we've agreed on the design, we begin to build, right? So we start with a landing zone, essentially an empty AWS account structure with just a baseline of AWS best practices applied, right? So MFA on users, deleting default VPCs, closing default security groups, ensuring encryption of all underlying EBS volumes is enabled within the EC2 service, things like that, right? We want to make sure that the landing zone itself meets your compliance requirements before we even start to get into the workloads, right? Whatever that may be. We work through the network architecture. We start building out VPCs. If there's a need for shared services among multiple environment workloads, we can set up different VPCs or network space for those shared services to easily make them available to multiple different environments, but keep them segregated enough from your production environment, which is probably required by your compliance requirements. So, and then we finish with, getting the dev environment stood up, getting that tested, and then implementing any proof of concept projects we were doing, and then finally roll on to production, right? Deploy, test. And before we go live, we want to make sure there's monitoring, logging, disaster recovery that we've tested, right? Not just theoretical disaster recovery, but actually tested and proven. Generally having at least annual DR tests that's a common requirement among multiple frameworks. And then once we have that all in place, we finally feel confident we can move forward with the cutover. And then we move on to monitoring and continuous improvement, right? So how do you maintain this? Let's move on to the next slide.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
So just wanted to kind of recap a little bit. So kind of getting to security compliance, really with Laith was talking about how do you choose the right framework, walking you through specifically SOC 2 PCI, and then understanding the different levels of compliance you're trying to get to. Lance, thank you for implementing the cloud implementation strategy, going through the security triad, the shared responsibility model, and then ultimately kind of going over implementing security compliance controls within your environment. And now I think the next question is how do we monitor this and continually improve it after we've done this?
Yeah, and Leif and I could probably, juggle this part and how Thoropass really helps with the ongoing maintenance. I think the ISO 27001 10.2 requirement really sums up what you do after you've implemented all these controls, after you've defined your policies, right? How do you continue to work on things? How do you continue to improve, right? How are you monitoring the success of the controls you identified, right? How do you measure that? Obviously, ongoing audits. There's going to be internal audits, at least probably an annual external audit, management reviews of policies, going over security incidents, right? Always looking for ways that you can continue to improve on the implementation of your security program, right? Laith, I'll let you add on to that, how Thoropass really can help there as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a great point, Lance. ISO 27001 requirement 10.2 continual improvement is a great use case. But the reality is just about every single information security compliance standard requires some type of maintenance, monitoring, and continuous improvement of your information security program. Really, once you kind of set up your environment and you build your environment, you put all the logging and monitoring tools in place, you'll still need a way to actually monitor that everything is working. And the reality is not everything works great all the time. Something is going to break. You're going to have a risk. You're going to have to treat that risk or mitigate a specific vulnerability, and you have to know about it in order for you to do it. Historically, the way this was done is really through calendar invite spreadsheets. People would just, have to remind themselves to go look at specific logs or alerts or whatever it might be. If you wanted to line this up directly with your information security compliance requirements, what you could do is look for a tool that integrates directly with your platforms and your security tools, ingest all of the data when it comes to looking at your specific vulnerabilities, your specific logs, the monitoring of your environment, and have it alert you when you're out of compliance for you to go do something. One of the things we built at Thoropass is a information security compliance platform that integrates directly with your cloud service provider environment and other ancillary security tools. So you can connect your specific tech stack and your tools directly to our platform. The platform will monitor whether or not you're in compliance. And if you fall out of compliance, it'll alert you to go fix whatever vulnerability was found and needs remediation. Just one way to go about it, one of many ways for sure.